It began with something so small, so ordinary, that no one thought twice about it. A family stepping onto a plane, a father guiding his children down the narrow aisle, smiles on their faces as they looked forward to the trip ahead. But within minutes, what should have been a simple journey turned into a nightmare that none of them would ever forget. The flight attendant's eyes lingered too long. Her tone cut sharper than it needed to. And when she singled out the two children, innocent, polite, unaware of what was coming, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers looked on, some whispering, some pretending not to notice. But the sting of prejudice was undeniable. Imagine being told you don't belong, not because of your behavior, not because of anything you've done, but because of the color of your skin. Imagine watching your children face that humiliation in front of strangers, powerless to shield them. That was the moment their father's world changed. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a protector, a leader, someone with the power to stop what was happening. And he would use it in a way no one on that plane could have imagined, because when hate takes flight, justice has a way of grounding it. So what really happened in that cabin? And how did one father turn humiliation into a lesson the world would never forget? Before the headlines, before the whispers, before the cabin full of strangers watched a father take control of a situation no one expected, there was only life. A simple, beautiful, ordinary life. He was a man who had climbed higher than anyone said he could. A black entrepreneur turned CEO, whose name appeared in magazines and whose speeches inspired young dreamers. But at home, none of that mattered. To his children, he was just dad. The man who braided hair in the morning rush, who burned pancakes on Saturday mornings, who let them stay up past bedtime when the world felt kind. Their house echoed with laughter, more often than arguments. Family pictures filled every wall, snapshots of birthday parties, vacations, and messy ice cream moments. To the outside world, he was a figure of power, wealth, and authority. Inside these walls, he was simply the heart of a family built on love. The twins, a boy and a girl, carried sunshine in their eyes. They mirrored their father's determination and their mother's warmth, innocent enough to believe the world would always welcome them. They had not yet felt the weight of looks that lingered too long, or words that sliced without needing to be shouted. For their father, that innocence was everything. It was a shield he fought daily to preserve, even though he knew the truth. Society wasn't always kind to families like his. His success didn't erase the color of his skin. His wealth didn't silence those who still believed he didn't belong. But at home, none of that noise got in. At home, love drowned out prejudice. And that is why the trip mattered. A getaway, a promise of memories. A reminder to his children that joy could still exist untouched. At least, that's what he believed, because even the strongest walls cannot keep out what waits beyond the front door. And on that journey, their ordinary life would collide with a cruelty that no child should ever face. They were only 9 years old, yet their presence could brighten an entire room. The twins were the kind of children strangers smiled at, the kind who asked too many questions, laughed too loudly, and filled the air with an energy that reminded everyone what childhood was supposed to feel like. Uncomplicated, full of wonder. The boy had his father's sharp eyes, always scanning, always curious, as though the world was a puzzle he was determined to solve. He loved planes, collected toy models, and could recite facts about airlines with the seriousness of a professor. His sister, softer in nature but no less fierce, carried her mother's grace. She loved books, sketch pads, and whispered stories before bed that made even her father pause to listen. Together, they were inseparable, two halves of the same heartbeat. At school, teachers praised their kindness, their eagerness to include others. Yet beneath the gold stars and glowing reports, there were shadows their parents noticed. A question, asked too innocently, "Why did that boy say our skin is different?" A hesitation when another child's parent pulled them away too quickly at a playground. Small cracks, hairline fractures, in the perfect bubble their parents fought to keep intact. Their father reassured them every time. "You are more than enough. You are light." He said it often enough that they believed it, repeating it back, to him in unison, whenever his tone grew serious. But deep down, he feared the day when their innocence would no longer protect them, when the world would show them cruelty, not as whispers, but as daggers. The trip was supposed to be a shield from that, a chance for them to see the world beyond their neighborhood, to experience adventure without question or judgment. He watched their excitement bubble as they packed little bags with favorite toys and argued over who got the window seat. To them, it was all fun, all laughter, all promise. They didn't know. They couldn't know that soon their wide-eyed innocence would be tested in the most public, humiliating way, and their father would be forced to choose, stay silent, or fight in front of an audience of strangers. Long before there were headlines, or boardrooms, or even the twins, there was just a man and a woman who refused to let the world decide who they could love. He had come from a background that demanded resilience. Every step of his journey, from crowded classrooms where teachers doubted him, to business meetings where his skin spoke louder than his resume, carved determination into his bones. She came from a different world, one where doors opened easily, where assumptions worked in her favor, and where comfort was a quiet constant. On paper, they weren't meant to collide. But life, in its stubborn way, placed them in the same space at the same time. Their first meeting was simple. A conference room, a handshake, a fleeting conversation. But it left an imprint. His confidence was steady, the kind earned through battles fought silently. Hers was lighter, softened by privilege, but sharpened by empathy. They weren't opposites, they were complements. Love did not come without cost. Families raised eyebrows, friends whispered. Some support was offered. Politely, but always with an undercurrent. "Are you sure? Do you know how hard this will be?" They knew. They felt the stares in restaurants, the hesitation in a waiter's tone, the way neighbors paused a beat too long before offering a smile. But they also felt something stronger. A bond that grew through laughter, through arguments that ended with forgiveness, through promises whispered late at night when the rest of the world doubted them. Love, for them, wasn't just an emotion. It was defiance. It was choosing each other in a society that would always question why. When the twins were born, their world became both more complicated and more beautiful. Holding those children meant holding hope itself. Yet, it also meant shielding them from the double weight of rejection, for being black in some eyes, for being mixed in others. Parents should dream only of futures, but for them, dreams always came tied to warnings. Still, they built their life brick by brick. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, family walks, and stories read in the living room. Vacations meant sandcastles, laughter, and the careful awareness of choosing destinations where safety came first. Every love story has trials. Theirs had more than most. But what bound them together wasn't the absence of prejudice. It was the decision, every single day, to love louder than the noise around them. And so, when the time came for the family trip, the flight that would soon test their resolve, they carried that same love with them. A love that had survived whispers, survived doubt, survived judgment. What they didn't know was that it would now have to survive open humiliation on display for an entire plane to witness. Trips had always been sacred in their household. Not extravagant escapes meant for flashing cameras, but intentional pauses, a way to step away from deadlines, from constant schedules, from the noise of responsibility. This trip, in particular, carried more weight. It was meant to be a celebration, a promise of new memories stitched together by laughter and photographs. The twins buzzed with excitement. Their suitcases were small but stuffed with treasures. His toy plane models carefully wrapped in socks, her sketchbook tucked between pajamas. They argued cheerfully over who got the better snacks for the flight, while their mother reminded them to pack jackets, just in case. Their father, watching it all, felt a quiet swell of pride. This was what he worked for. Not the corner, office, not the accolades, but this chaos of joy in his living room. The morning of the flight, everything seemed ordinary. Breakfast eaten too fast, luggage stacked by the door, reminders not to forget passports. But beneath the routine, there was a trace of unease their father couldn't quite shake. Traveling had never been simple for them. It wasn't the logistics, it was the stares. The way people's eyes flicked from his dark skin to his wife's. Fair one, then down to the children who carried both. At the airport, it began almost immediately. A security guard's double take. A check-in clerk's forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. A fellow traveler who muttered something under, his breath loud enough to sting but soft enough to deny. These weren't new experiences. They were the background hum of living in a world that didn't always welcome families like theirs. The twins noticed none of it. They pressed their faces against the tall windows, pointing out planes taxiing across the runway. They giggled as they pretended to be pilots, their voices carrying the kind of joy that drowned out the coldness around them. Their parents let them enjoy it, swallowing the bitterness, determined not to let ugliness touch their children's excitement. Boarding was called, and the family gathered their things. The father felt it then, that familiar tightening in his chest. He had felt it in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in classrooms, a warning. A reminder that prejudice did not wait for invitations. It arrived unannounced, unapologetic. Still, he told himself this was just another trip. He kissed his wife's forehead, placed his hands on the twins' shoulders, and guided them toward the gate. What he didn't know was that the flight they were about to board would become the stage for a cruelty sharper than any passing glare. A cruelty aimed not at him this time, but at the very children he lived to protect. And once that cruelty struck, silence would no longer be an option. The boarding tunnel was crowded, a slow shuffle of luggage wheels and restless passengers. The twins clung to their backpacks, whispering jokes to each other as their father guided them forward. To them, it was an adventure. The narrow tunnel, the anticipation of stepping into a giant machine that would carry them above the clouds. But for their father, every step felt heavier. He had traveled countless times before, but he knew this ritual too well, the glances, the subtle pauses, the unspoken questions. He had learned to ignore them, to shield his family with calm composure. Yet something about this flight felt different. As they entered the cabin, the twins' eyes widened with wonder. Rows of seats stretched endlessly. Overhead bins clicked open and shut, and passengers shuffled into place. The boy tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering about the engines he could hear outside. His sister pressed her sketchbook against her chest, already dreaming of drawing clouds from the window. They made their way down the aisle. That was when the atmosphere shifted. A few passengers stared longer than necessary. One woman tightened her grip on her purse. A man in a business suit muttered, shaking his head as though their very presence disrupted his comfort. None of it was loud, none of it was direct. But prejudice rarely announces itself. It simmers, quiet, but cutting. The mother squeezed her husband's hand, a silent reassurance. Let it go. Focus on the kids. He nodded, swallowing the unease. The twins, blissfully unaware, climbed into their seats with excitement, arguing playfully over the view. The flight attendant approached then, smiling, but not the kind of smile that reached the eyes. Her gaze lingered on the twins too long. Her questions were clipped, her tone sharp, as if their very existence needed to be justified. It was subtle enough that nearby passengers pretended not to notice, yet heavy enough that the father felt his chest tighten. He had seen that look before, that calculated politeness masking judgment. The plane filled with the rustle of seatbelts, the thud of luggage being stowed, the low murmur of passengers settling in. The twins leaned against the windows, chattering about takeoff, their laughter spilling into the quiet. But the father couldn't ignore the weight of what was coming. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, the moment where innocence would collide with cruelty. He prayed he was wrong, that this was just another trip, just another flight. Yet deep down, he knew. The storm hadn't started yet. But the clouds were already gathering, and when it broke, it would test everything: his patience, his power, and his love for the children, who had no idea their lives were about to change mid-air. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane prepared for takeoff. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening belts, tucking bags, adjusting pillows. For a few brief minutes, everything seemed ordinary. The twins giggled, pressing their faces to the small oval windows, pointing at the runway lights blinking in the dusk. Then the first crack appeared. The flight attendant returned, her smile thin as paper. She leaned down, eyes fixed on the children. "Are these your seats?" she asked, her tone sharp. The father straightened, nodding calmly. "Yes, they are." Her gaze didn't leave the twins. "They need to sit properly. No leaning over the armrest, no blocking the aisle." The children froze, their joy slipping away like a balloon untied from its string. They weren't misbehaving, no more than any other child excited for takeoff. But the weight of her stare made them shrink back. Around them, passengers stirred. Some pretended not to notice. Others exchanged glances, silent witnesses to something they weren't willing to name. The father's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "They'll behave, don't worry." She lingered a second too long, then walked away, heels clicking against the narrow floor. The twins looked at their father, confusion clouding their faces. "Did we do something wrong?" his son whispered. He shook his head. "No, you did nothing wrong. Remember what I always tell you. You are more than enough." He reached for their hands, squeezing them gently. But inside, he felt the old, familiar fire. The kind that came when dignity was questioned, when innocence was treated as offense. He had spent years containing it, mastering the art of composure. But now, with his children under the spotlight, it stirred restlessly. The plane lifted, engines roaring as the ground fell away. For a few moments, the twins' excitement returned, their faces glowing as the clouds swallowed the horizon. Yet, the father couldn't relax. He could feel eyes still on them, the subtle weight of judgment pressing in from all directions. And when the flight attendant returned again, this time with a tray of drinks, her words were even sharper. She placed cups carefully in front of nearby passengers, her voice warm, polite. But when she reached their row, her expression cooled. "No spills," she said, sliding the cups toward the children, as if she were offering them a test rather than a treat. "If they make a mess, it'll be on you." The twins exchanged a nervous glance, holding their cups with trembling hands. Their mother's face tightened, her lips parting as though to speak, but the father touched her wrist, a silent plea for patience. "Not yet." He leaned closer to his children. "Drink slowly," he whispered, his voice steady. "You're fine. Don't worry about her." But the truth was clear. This wasn't about spilled drinks. It wasn't about leaning too far into the aisle. It was about something else entirely, something darker, older, woven into the very air. They breathed. The father knew it, and he knew it was only the beginning. The plane leveled out, cruising through the clouds, but the air inside the cabin felt heavier with every passing minute. Conversations drifted in soft murmurs, the clink of plastic cups against tray tables filling the quiet. For most passengers, it was an ordinary flight. For one family, it was becoming something else entirely. The twins sat stiffly now, their earlier joy replaced by unease. They held their cups as if any wrong move would prove the attendant right. Their father watched them closely, his heart aching at the sight. He had worked so hard to keep them untouched by cruelty, to let them believe the world was as fair as the books they read at night. And now, thousands of feet above the ground, that illusion was slipping through their fingers. The flight attendant returned. She didn't smile this time. She didn't even pretend. Her eyes swept over the children, then narrowed on the father. "Keep them quiet," she said curtly. "Other passengers are trying to rest." The boy's head snapped up. "We weren't." "Loud!" But his father's hand rested gently on his shoulder. "Shh, it's okay." The father felt a storm building inside him. Every word, every glance from that attendant was stripping away layers of his children's innocence. They weren't misbehaving, weren't causing trouble, yet they were being treated like intruders, in a space they had every right to occupy. The attendant leaned in closer, her voice low, edged with venom. "If they can't follow basic rules, maybe they shouldn't be flying at all." The girl's eyes welled with tears. She didn't understand why a stranger's words cut so deep, only that they did. Her brother clenched his fists, torn between fear and the instinct to defend her. Their mother inhaled sharply, her patience unraveling. But again, the father stopped her with a glance. Not yet. Not here. He knew the weight of confrontation, knew how quickly it could turn against them, but the attendant wasn't finished. She straightened, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people think the rules don't apply to them. But this is my cabin. Everyone follows the same standards." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement without fully understanding why. Others stared at their laps, unwilling to meet the father's eyes. He sat frozen for a moment, his hands clenched on his knees, his breath shallow. His children stared at him, waiting for protection, for answers, for the reassurance that they weren't wrong for simply existing. He forced a smile. "You've done nothing wrong," he whispered to them. "Remember that. Nothing." But inside, his calm was cracking. The fire he had held back for so long flickered dangerously close to the surface. He could feel the breaking point coming, as surely as the plane cut through the clouds, because this was no longer about politeness, no longer about spilled drinks or quiet voices. This was about prejudice, naked, unapologetic, and aimed at the two souls he loved most in the world, and he knew, if it continued, he would not stay silent. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling the start of quiet hours. Passengers shifted into their seats, pulling blankets to their shoulders, preparing for rest. But in row 21, there was no rest, only tension coiled like a spring. The twins sat silently, their small bodies pressed close together. Once, their giggles would have filled the space, their questions spilling out with excitement. Now they barely moved, as if shrinking themselves might keep them safe. Their father watched, his chest tight. Children should never learn so early that silence is sometimes survival. The flight attendant appeared again, her expression harder than before. She stopped at their row, her hands on her hips. "I'll say this once more," she announced, loud, enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "If your children can't behave, we'll have to escalate this. Do you understand?" A ripple spread through the cabin. Passengers lifted their heads, murmurs sparking in the dim light. A woman across the aisle frowned. "They're not bothering anyone," she whispered, but the attendant ignored her. The boy finally spoke, his voice trembling. "We didn't do anything." It was a simple truth, but truth had no weight here. The attendant's lips curled. "Talking back now? You're on thin ice." Tears slid down his sister's cheeks, her small hands clutching her father's arm. The father's own composure wavered, fury rising hot in his veins. His children weren't acting out. They weren't disruptive. They were being targeted, humiliated, in front of strangers, stripped of their innocence in real time. He opened his mouth, ready to respond, but a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me." A passenger in the row behind them spoke. They're fine. I've been sitting here the whole time. The kids haven't done a thing." The cabin grew still. Another passenger chimed in, hesitant. "Yeah, I didn't notice." Them causing trouble. But just as quickly, a man near the front shook his head. "If the attendant says there's an issue, maybe there is. Some people don't follow rules. Makes the flight harder for everyone." The divide formed instantly. Voices of support versus murmurs of suspicion. Some passengers defended the family, others leaned on prejudice, and many simply stayed quiet, unwilling to choose sides. The father felt the eyes again, burning into him, judging, waiting. His wife squeezed his hand beneath the armrest, her eyes pleading for patience. But he could feel patience slipping away. The attendant's voice sharpened, dripping with authority. "If there's one more disruption, I'll file a report. Security will be waiting when we land." The words landed like a blade. His children gasped, their innocence collapsing under the weight of a threat they couldn't fully understand. Security. Trouble. As though they were criminals, not children excited for a family trip. The father's heart pounded. His hands trembled. Against the armrests, not with fear, but with rage held barely in check. For years he had swallowed these moments, letting them pass to protect his family. But now it was his family under attack. His children. And something inside him whispered, "Enough." The plane soared smoothly through the night, but in row 21, a storm was gathering. The father knew the next move would decide everything. His silence had protected them before. But this time, silence was starting to look like surrender. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, a steady roar beneath the tension gripping the cabin. Passengers who had tried to rest were now awake, their gazes flicking toward row 21, drawn to the drama unraveling there. Some pretended to ignore it, headphones pushed tighter against their ears. Others watched openly, their faces lit by a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and quiet judgment. The twins sat like statues, shoulders hunched, eyes wide. They had stopped speaking altogether, too afraid that a single word might unleash another scolding. Their father looked down at them, his chest aching with a mix of rage and sorrow. This flight was supposed to be joy. It was supposed to be freedom. Instead, it had become a lesson in cruelty, delivered by a stranger in uniform. The flight attendant returned, her posture rigid, her smile gone. She didn't bother lowering her voice this time. "If they can't control themselves, you'll all need to be moved. Families like yours cause too many problems on flights. Families like yours." The words sliced through him. Not subtle, not veiled, open, direct. His fists tightened against the armrests, nails biting into his palms. His wife gasped quietly beside him, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Passengers murmured. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded faintly, as if prejudice sounded reasonable when wrapped in authority. One woman leaned forward from a nearby row. "Ma'am, with all due respect, they haven't done anything wrong. I've been watching." The attendant's eyes narrowed. "I'll thank you not to interfere." The woman's cheeks flushed, but she didn't speak again. Silence reclaimed the cabin. The twins looked at their father, their eyes pleading. They wanted him to fix this, to make it stop, to protect them from a cruelty they couldn't name but could feel cutting into their hearts. His breath came shallow, controlled. He leaned toward them, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You're not the problem. Remember that. You are not the problem." But his own resolve was crumbling. Every second of humiliation scraped at him. He had swallowed insults his entire life, worn masks of composure in boardrooms, smiled through disrespect in places where anger would have cost him everything. But here, in this cabin, with his children under attack, he felt the mask cracking. The attendant folded her arms. "Last warning. If there's another issue, I'll have you removed when we land." Don't test me. Removed. The word echoed like a threat, one meant to humiliate, to stamp them as troublemakers before an entire plane. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily. Some avoided eye contact, desperate to stay out of it. Others stared openly, waiting for him to snap, waiting for confirmation of the stereotype the attendant dangled like bait. His wife placed her hand over his. Her touch trembled, her eyes pleading. Not yet. Don't give her what she wants. But he could feel it, his breaking point. His children sat small and frightened beside him, their joy extinguished. The woman standing over them wielded power she didn't deserve, and every second of his silence felt like betrayal. The cabin was thick with expectation. Passengers held their breath. The twins clung to him. The attendant's gaze dared him to speak, and in that moment, one thought roared through his mind. If I stay silent now, what will they learn about the world? The engines roared on, but in row 21, it was the sound of a man deciding whether to unleash the storm inside him. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the low rumble of the engines and the faint hiss of circulating air. Every passenger seemed to be waiting, eyes flicking between the uniformed attendant and the man in seat 21C. Tension hung so thick it was almost visible, like smoke after a fire. The twins pressed into their father's side, trembling under the weight of humiliation they didn't deserve. The boy's jaw was set, his small fists balled tight, fighting tears he didn't want to show. His sister's cheeks were wet, her eyes pleading for protection, for comfort, for an end to this nightmare at 30,000 feet. And the father, he was stone. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt everything. Rage coursed through him like fire, threatening to consume the control he had mastered for decades. He had built a career on restraint, on staying calm when the world tried to provoke. Him, on swallowing insults too costly to answer. But here, with his children under attack, silence felt like surrender. The flight attendant leaned in, her words sharp enough to pierce. "Sir, this is my final warning. If your family cannot behave, we'll make arrangements with security when we land. You've already disrupted this flight long enough." Gasps rippled through the rows. Some passengers turned in their seats, glaring at her with disbelief. Others stared at the father, waiting to see if he would explode or submit. His wife's hand gripped his arm, her eyes wide with fear. She had seen this moment before, the way the fire inside him rose until it shook his frame. But she also knew this was different. This wasn't about business deals or boardrooms. This was about his children's dignity, stripped bare in front of strangers. He rose slowly from his seat. The movement alone sent a shiver through the cabin. Passengers stiffened, whispers flaring like sparks. The twins clutched each other, watching with wide eyes as their father stood tall, his presence filling the narrow aisle. His voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that carried the weight of storms. "We've done nothing wrong." The attendant's lips parted, but he raised a hand, silencing her. His gaze swept the cabin, locking eyes with passenger after passenger. "My children have done nothing wrong." Murmurs swelled. A man nodded in agreement. A woman whispered, "That's true." Others stayed silent, but the unease was unmistakable. The attendant's face flushed, her authority challenged. "Sir, you need to sit down. Now." But he didn't. He couldn't. Not anymore. He looked down at his children, two innocent souls who had boarded this plane full of joy, now crushed by cruelty. And in that moment, he knew the time for silence had passed. The roar inside him finally broke free. "You humiliate them in front of strangers," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin. "You reduce them to nothing with your words. But they are not nothing. They are everything." Gasps erupted. Some passengers clapped softly. Others sat frozen, unsure. The cabin was no longer neutral. It was divided, a theater of justice and prejudice colliding. The attendant stiffened, her authority slipping. "Sir, sit down or—" But he had already crossed the line. Because when a father's love is pushed against the wall, there is no seatbelt strong enough to hold it down. He fell. Cabin was electric, every pair of eyes fixed on the man standing tall in row 21. For hours he had absorbed the blows in silence, swallowed the venom directed at his children, kept his fury caged. But now, the cage lay shattered at his feet. His voice thundered through the narrow aisle, steady but unflinching. "My children are not your target practice. They are not your scapegoat for whatever prejudice you carry." Passengers jolted in their seats. Some turned away, discomfort etched on their faces. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the raw truth tearing through the stale, recycled air. The flight attendant stiffened, her cheeks blazing. "Sir, lower your voice. You're disturbing everyone." But the father didn't lower anything. Not his voice, not his stance, not the weight of his words. He took a step forward, his presence commanding. "They disturbed no one until you decided they were guilty of something they never did. You humiliated them. You threatened them. And you expect me to sit quietly, teaching them that silence is survival?" His son's eyes widened, pride flickering through the fear. His daughter clutched her mother's arm, whispering, "Daddy's standing up for us." The father raised his chin, scanning the rows around him. "Look at them," he said, gesturing. "To the twins, children, innocent, full of joy until it was stolen from them here in front of all of you. And not one of you deserves to sit comfortably while they are treated as less than human." Murmurs surged through the cabin. A woman dabbed tears from her eyes. A man in business attire frowned, shaking his head, muttering about making a scene. But others leaned in, emboldened by the courage in his voice. "He's right," someone whispered. "They didn't do anything," another added, louder this time. The tide was shifting. The attendant's composure wavered, cracks forming in her mask of authority. "Sir, if you don't sit down this instant, I will—" "You will what?" His voice sliced through hers, sharp as glass. "File a report? Call security? Go ahead, do it. Because when they ask why, you'll have to explain how you targeted 2 children for existing. You'll have to explain why your authority was built on prejudice instead of truth." The words landed like thunder. The cabin erupted, some passengers clapping, others gasping, voices rising in a swell of conflict. The divide was no longer silent. It was alive, pulsing through every row. The twins clung to each other, watching their father with wide, shining eyes. For the first time since the humiliation began, their fear gave way to something else, hope. Because in that moment, they saw him not just as their father, but as a shield, unbreakable, unapologetic. The father turned back to the attendant, his voice quieter now, but sharper for it. "You picked the wrong family to break tonight." The cabin held its breath. The confrontation was no longer avoidable. The storm had arrived, and it would not pass quietly. The cabin was no longer a place of quiet travel. It was a stage, a pressure cooker of voices and emotions colliding in the stale, recycled air. The father's words had cracked something open, and now it poured out from every direction. From the front of the plane, a man in a suit barked, "Sit down and stop making a scene. You're scaring people." His tone carried that familiar superiority, the kind that cloaked prejudice in the guise of order. But before the father could answer, another voice rose. A woman with gray hair, sitting just across the aisle, turned sharply toward the suited man. "No, he's not scaring anyone." "She is," she said, pointing directly at the attendant. "That woman has been harassing those children since we boarded. I've watched the whole thing." Gasps followed her words. Heads swiveled. Some passengers nodded in agreement, murmuring their support. Others muttered under their breath, uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to intervene. Die. Flight attendant's face tightened, her authority slipping further with each second. She raised her voice, sharp and defensive. This is my cabin. I am responsible for safety, and this behavior is unacceptable. The father's gaze locked on hers. His voice was low, but it carried like a blade cutting through fog. Safety? Is that what you call it? Singling out children who've done nothing wrong? Threatening them with security? Humiliating them until they're too afraid to smile? The boy straightened slightly, emboldened by his father's strength. The girl sniffled but lifted her chin, trying to be brave. Passengers watched them, the innocence of their faces clashing against the cruelty they had endured. A young mother from 2 rows back spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. I've got children too. If anyone treated them like this, I'd lose my mind. He has every right to stand up for his kids. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, echoing through the cabin. The attendant froze, her authority unraveling under the weight of witness and solidarity. Still, a man near the window scoffed, crossing his arms. Oh, come on. Playing the victim card? This is exactly why flights get delayed. People like him. Looking for attention, the father turned, his eyes burning with a controlled fury. Do you think I want this? Do you think I wanted to stand up here in front of all of you just to defend my children's right to exist? This isn't a performance. This is survival. The words struck deep. Silence swept over the plane again, heavier this time. Even those who disagreed couldn't meet his gaze. The flight attendant, desperate to regain control, snapped, That's enough. Sit down before I call the captain. The father stepped closer, his frame towering, his presence unshakable. His voice thundered now, leaving no room for doubt. Call him. Call whoever you want. But understand this. When we land, the story of what you did here will not stay in this cabin. Every witness, every phone, every set of eyes that watched you break children for sport will carry it beyond these walls. You wanted silence. Instead, you will have truth. The passengers erupted again, cheers, claps, words of agreement spilling. Through the rows. The tide had shifted fully. The family was no longer isolated. They were surrounded by voices refusing to be quiet. The twins looked at their father, their fear dissolving into awe. For the first time, they saw that love wasn't just soft. It could also roar like thunder. The attendant stood frozen, her authority reduced to fragments. And for the first time since the flight began, the father felt something shift inside him, not just anger, but power. Because prejudice thrives in silence. But tonight, silence had been broken. The roar of voices still echoed through the cabin when the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I understand there's a situation in the cabin. Please remain calm. The announcement did nothing to ease the tension. If anything, it raised the stakes. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some pulled out phones, recording discreetly as though capturing history in real time. The twins leaned into their mother, their small hands clutching hers tightly, their eyes fixed on their father as though he were their only anchor. Moments later, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the aisle, tall, uniform crisp, authority radiating with every stride. The flight attendant hurried to him, her voice a frantic whisper that carried just enough for the closest rows to hear. She's lying, a passenger muttered. We've all seen it. The father remained standing, shoulders squared, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He had faced boardrooms filled with skepticism, crowds that doubted his worth, but this was different. This was not about him. It was about 2 children learning what kind of world they belonged to. The captain raised a hand. What's going on here? The flight attendant launched into her version. Disruptive children. A father refusing to cooperate. I've given multiple warnings. This family is making it impossible to maintain order. Gasps broke out. A woman 2 rows, backshot to her feet. That's a lie. I've been watching the whole time. Those kids haven't done a thing. Others joined in. She targeted them. The kids were quiet. This is discrimination, plain and simple. Voices rose, overlapping. The truth, swelling until it drowned out her excuses. The captain turned to the father. His tone was firm but measured. "Sir, is this true?" The father's voice, when it came, was steady, but it carried the weight of centuries. "My children were joyful when we boarded this plane, excited, innocent. And then they were reduced to silence by someone who saw them not as children, but as a problem. She humiliated them, threatened them, made them feel small for no reason other than who they are. And I will not let them grow up believing they are less than anyone else here." The cabin held its breath. The captain's eyes flicked between the father, the attendant, and the murmuring passengers. The truth was undeniable, and the weight of it filled the air like a storm. One by one, passengers began to speak. "He's right. We saw everything. Those kids deserve an apology." The murmurs grew louder, rolling like thunder through the rows. The flight attendant paled, her authority dissolving under the flood of witness. For the first time, she looked small, cornered by the truth she could no longer twist. The father bent, slightly, looking his children in the eyes. His voice softened, but every passenger heard it. "Listen to me. You are not less. You are not wrong. And you never, ever have to shrink to make others comfortable." Tears streamed down his daughter's cheeks, but she smiled through them. His son's chin lifted, pride flickering across his young face. The cabin erupted, applause, cheers, voices rising in solidarity. Strangers who had stayed silent found their courage, their clapping hands echoing through the metal walls. The father straightened, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. "You wanted silence," he said, turning back to the attendant, his voice low but cutting. "But what you got was truth, and truth is louder than you will ever be." The captain's voice cut through the noise. Firm, final. "This situation is over. Sir, please sit with your family. And as for you..." He turned to the attendant, his tone leaving no room for debate. "We'll be discussing this when we land." A hush fell. The balance had shifted. Justice, fragile but undeniable, filled the cabin. And in row 21, a father sat down, not defeated, but victorious. Because he had given his children something prejudice could never take, proof that their worth was undeniable. The roar of applause slowly faded, but the energy in the cabin lingered like heat after lightning strikes. People shifted in their seats, some relieved, others shaken by what they had just witnessed. A few still looked uncomfortable, arms crossed, their silence revealing the bias they would never admit aloud. But most were changed. Their eyes followed the father as he sat back down, his presence still commanding even in the narrow seat. His children pressed against him, their small hands clutching his arms as if afraid he might disappear if they let go. The boy whispered, his voice low but fierce, "You didn't let her win." The father looked down at him, his expression softening. "No, and neither will you. Ever." The girl leaned her head against his chest, her tears finally slowing. "You made them listen, Daddy." Those words struck him harder than the confrontation itself. Because that's what it had always been about, making the world listen when it wanted to ignore, silencing lies with undeniable truth. He held them close, his heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier leaned over. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "They needed to see their father fight for them." Other passengers nodded quietly, some mouthing words of support, some simply offering warm smiles to the children. The tide of opinion, once hesitant, had fully turned. The family was no longer isolated. They were surrounded by strangers who now carried their story. But not everyone joined in. The suited man at the front muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Disgraceful, making a scene like that. His words didn't carry far, but the boy heard. For a second, his shoulders tensed. The father caught it. He placed a hand on his son's back and said, loud enough for those around to hear, "Some people will always live in shadows. Don't waste your light trying to change them." The passengers nearby nodded, approving murmurs rippling around them. The suited man turned his face to the window, silenced without another word. The flight attendant had vanished toward the galley, her absence louder than her presence had ever been. No one missed her. The cabin crew moved quietly, their steps careful, their faces tight, as if they too were processing what had unraveled. For the rest of the flight, the twins slowly relaxed, their innocence not fully restored, but stitched together by the pride in their father's stand. They laughed. Again, small laughs at first, like timid birds testing their wings, then louder, freer, until they began to sound like children again. The father leaned back, finally letting his body rest against the seat, but his mind raced, the weight of what had just happened pressing on him. He had not planned to become the center of a storm at 30,000 feet, but storms have a way of finding you when silence is no longer an option. As the cabin lights dimmed again, the passengers settled into uneasy quiet. Yet it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence carried weight, the kind that comes when truth has been spoken so loudly it leaves an echo. And for his children, that echo would last far longer than the flight. The seatbelt sign chimed as the plane began its descent. The world outside shifted from endless sky to glittering city lights, sprawling like constellations below. Passengers adjusted their seats, packed away blankets, and prepared for the return to solid ground. But inside row 21, no one moved. The family sat close, united, still wrapped in the aftershock of what had unfolded miles above the earth. The twins had stopped trembling. Their small bodies leaned against their father, anchored by the steady rhythm of his breath. They had witnessed cruelty, but they had also witnessed courage. And that balance, pain and power, would leave a mark deeper than any lesson from a far book. The intercom crackled. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The father glanced toward the galley where the flight attendant remained hidden, her face unseen since the captain's ruling. Her absence spoke volumes, a silence thick with shame. As the wheels touched the runway, the cabin jolted, a reminder that every storm must end somewhere. Passengers clapped softly at the landing, habit, relief, or perhaps applause meant for. More than the pilot this time. The father exhaled slowly. He thought it was over. But he knew better. Prejudice rarely ends with apologies. It lingers, waiting for its chance to rise again. When the plane rolled to a stop and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the cabin filled with movement. Overhead bins opened, bags shuffled, voices rose. But in row 21, the family remained seated, waiting, watching. Then came the words, "Will the family in row 21 please remain seated? Security will meet you at the gate." Gasps rippled through the rows. The mother stiffened, her hand gripping her husband's arm. The twins froze, their eyes wide with fresh fear. But the father, he didn't flinch. He had expected this. It was the final card, the last attempt to shame them into silence. He rose slowly, towering above the seated passengers, his face calm but unyielding. "Security?" he said, his voice low but carrying. "Good. Let them come. Let them hear the truth from every witness here." The passengers erupted again. "This is wrong. They don't deserve this. We'll stand with them." Voices rose in protest, filling the cabin with a force greater than any authority. By the time the doors opened, 2 security officers stood waiting at the gate. But what they met wasn't a subdued family. It was a crowd of witnesses spilling into the jet bridge, voices overlapping, retelling the story before it could be twisted. She targeted the kids. They did nothing wrong. The father stood up for them, that's all. The officers raised their hands, trying to calm the flood. But the truth was undeniable. It wasn't just the family's word anymore. It was an entire cabin. The father stepped forward, his children at his side. His voice was steady, final. We will leave this plane with our dignity intact. And no report you file can erase what these people saw. The officers exchanged glances, then stepped aside. There would be no arrest, no stain, no false accusation allowed to stand. The family walked past, their heads high, the crowd parting. For them, like a path carved through stormy waters. The twins held their father's hands, their fear replaced with something stronger. They had seen cruelty, but they had also seen the power of truth. And as they walked into the airport lights, their small faces carried something unbreakable: pride. Because sometimes the loudest victories aren't won in boardrooms or courtrooms. Sometimes they're won in the aisles of an airplane where love refuses to be silenced. Outside the airport doors, the night air was thick with humidity, carrying the smell of jet fuel and asphalt. Neon lights flickered against the glass walls, taxis lined up in restless rows, and voices echoed in the distance. Yet for the family walking out of the terminal, the world felt strangely quiet, as though even the city itself had paused to honor what had just happened. The twins clung tightly to their father's hands, their small legs moving fast to keep pace with his steady stride. Their mother walked close beside them, her eyes scanning the crowd as if expecting another confrontation. But none came. The chaos was behind them now. The father exhaled, long and deep. For hours his chest had been filled with fire, his voice sharpened into a weapon he hadn't planned to use. Now, as the cool air touched his skin, the weight of it all began to settle. He had defended them. He had not bent, not broken. And yet exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. The boy broke the silence first. "Daddy, were you scared?" His voice was small, but steady, as though he already knew the answer. The father looked down at him, slowing his steps. "Yes," he admitted softly. "I was scared, not for me, for you, for what that moment would teach you if I stayed quiet." The girl squeezed his hand. "But you didn't stay quiet." He knelt to their level, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights. "Because silence is what people like her expect. And I need you to know, your voice is stronger than their hate. Always." Their mother knelt too, wrapping them both into her arms. Her own eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her voice was firm. "Tonight, you saw what the world can be like, but you also saw what love does when it refuses to back down." The twins nodded, their young faces solemn, as if the night had aged them in ways no child should have to endure. Nearby, passengers who had stood with them filtered out of the terminal. Some caught the father's eye and offered nods of respect, small gestures of solidarity. A woman approached briefly, touching his arm. "You changed something in there," she said, before disappearing into the crowd. The father straightened, watching the night stretch wide before them. The storm on the plane was over, but he knew this was not the last time his children would face such darkness. Prejudice didn't disappear with apologies or applause. It waited, lurking, always ready to rise again. But tonight, his children had seen something they would never forget. A father who refused to let hate define them. And in that truth, there was hope. The house was quiet when they returned, its familiar walls offering the comfort of safety, though the memory of the flight clung to them like shadows that refused to fade. Suitcases sat unopened by the door, shoes scattered across the entryway. Normally, the twins would have raced upstairs, fighting over who got the bathroom first, or rummaging through bags for forgotten snacks. But tonight, they moved slower, their energy dimmed, their innocence marked by the weight of what they had witnessed. The father lowered himself into his favorite chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. He loosened his tie, rubbed his temples, and let the silence wash over him. His wife joined him, sitting on the armrest, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. Neither spoke at first. They didn't need to. The silence itself carried the story. Upstairs, the twins whispered in their room. The boy clutched one of his toy airplanes, spinning its tiny wheels with restless fingers. "Why did she hate us, just for being there?" he asked softly. His sister hugged her sketchpad, tracing invisible lines with her pencil. "Because some people don't want us to belong, but Daddy showed them we do." They sat together in the dim light, their whispered exchange carrying both confusion and pride. Downstairs, the father finally broke the silence. "Did I do enough?" His voice was low, almost to himself, but his wife heard. She turned to him, her eyes firm. "You did what mattered. You showed them they aren't invisible. You showed them that their worth isn't something anyone gets to decide." His gaze softened, but the question still haunted him. Could he protect them from every storm? Could he shield them forever from the ugliness of the world? He knew the answer, and it cut deeply. No. But he could give them tools, strength, and the memory of moments like tonight, proof that dignity is worth fighting for. The twins padded downstairs, clutching their treasures. They climbed onto their parents' laps, curling into the safety of their arms. The boy whispered, "I wasn't scared at the end. Not when you stood up." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with certainty. "You made me feel strong." Tears welled in their father's eyes, though he blinked them back. He kissed their foreheads, holding them close. "That's all I wanted," he said softly. The four of them sat together in the quiet living room, the echoes of the flight fading into the background. The storm had scarred them, but it had also carved something deeper: resilience. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of what had happened miles above its glowing lights. But inside this home, the memory would remain, not as a wound, but as a reminder they had faced prejudice, and they had answered it with truth. By morning, the storm that began in the sky had descended onto the ground. What the father didn't realize, as he tucked his children into bed the night before, was that several passengers had recorded everything. Clips from the flight circulated within hours. A father standing tall in the aisle, his voice steady, his words like fire, the cries of his children, the cheers of strangers, and the trembling authority of a flight attendant caught in her own prejudice. The videos spread quickly, shared, reposted, debated. Headlines appeared online. Father defends twins against racism at 30,000 feet. Comment sections erupted, some praising his courage, others trying to twist the story. But the truth was too clear, too raw to be dismissed. The world had seen it with their own eyes. At the breakfast table, the twins scrolled through the articles on a tablet, their faces filled with wonder. "Daddy, they're talking about us," the boy said, pointing to a headline. His sister frowned slightly. "But is that good?" Their father took the tablet gently from their hands, setting it aside. "What matters is not what they say about us, but what you know about yourselves. That night, you saw who you are. Don't ever forget it." Still, the reality was inescapable. Neighbors stopped them on the street, offering quiet words of respect. Colleagues at the father's company shook his hand with new gravity, some confessing they had never realized the weight he carried daily. And strangers, people they had never met, sent messages, some filled with gratitude, others sharing their own painful stories of being silenced. But not all voices were kind. Hate surfaced too, venomous and predictable, hiding behind screens. Accusations of exaggeration, claims that he had played the race card, words sharpened to wound. The father read some of them in silence, his jaw tight before closing the screen. His wife touched his hand. "Don't let them take more of you. You gave enough already." He nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The fight wasn't about proving anything to strangers. It was about showing his children the power of truth, no matter how loud lies tried to drown it. That night, as he tucked the twins into bed again, his son asked, "Daddy, are we famous now?" The father smiled faintly, brushing back his son's hair. "No, we're not famous, we're just visible. And sometimes that's more dangerous, but also more important." The twins fell asleep with that thought, their small bodies curled beneath blankets, while their father sat awake in the hallway, the glow of the videos replaying in his mind. He hadn't wanted this kind of attention, but perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps the world needed to see what he had been forced to show. The story had begun in a narrow aisle, inside a steel cabin, but its impact had spread far beyond the clouds, and there was no taking it back. Days passed, but the flight lived on inside the twins. At school, their classmates whispered about the story. Some had seen the videos. Others had overheard parents talking late at night. The boy noticed the stares, some curious, some admiring, and some with that sharp edge of judgment he was too young to name but old enough to feel. He sat at his desk, pencil tapping against paper, when a classmate leaned over. "Was it true? Did that lady really say those things?" The boy hesitated. His chest tightened, but then he remembered his father's words. "Silence teaches the wrong lesson." He lifted his chin and answered simply, "Yes, but my dad didn't let her win." The classmate blinked, wide-eyed, and nodded slowly, as if absorbing something bigger than just a story. His sister faced her own moment. In art class, she sketched an airplane, but not an ordinary one. This one had no wings, no engines. Instead, it was carried on the backs of people, all different, all connected. When her teacher asked about it, she explained softly, "Because sometimes people have to carry the weight together. That's how it flies." The teacher stared at her drawing, moved to silence. At home, the twins grew restless with questions. "Daddy, will it happen again?" the girl asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. The father pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "Yes," he said honestly. "It may. The world doesn't change overnight. But now you know you don't face it alone. You fight with truth, and you carry each other." The boy frowned. "But what if no one listens next time?" His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you keep speaking, because silence only feeds the lie. Even if the world turns away, you don't stop reminding it who you are." Their mother listened, quietly, her eyes wet, her heart torn between fear and pride. She wished she could promise her children safety, but promises like that would only be broken. What she could give them instead was strength, the kind their father had shown them in that narrow aisle. That night, the twins wrote in their journals before bed. The boy scribbled plans for a future where he became a pilot, determined to command the skies with fairness. The girl filled pages with drawings, figures standing tall, unbroken, their voices carrying louder than hate. They were still children, but children who had seen enough to understand. The world wasn't always fair. Yet they had also seen something stronger than cruelty. Love that refused to bow, and that realization planted something inside them. Not bitterness, not despair, but resolve. The kind of resolve that doesn't fade, even when innocence does. Weeks had passed since the flight, yet the memory lingered like a scar. Visible, permanent, but no longer painful to touch. Life had resumed its rhythm. The twins went back to school, their laughter returning in full, though sharper now, edged with the wisdom of what they had lived through. Their mother found comfort in small routines, packing lunches, folding laundry, brushing her daughter's hair before bed, grateful for the ordinary after the chaos of that night. But the father carried the weight differently. Each evening, after the house had quieted, he would sit alone by the window, city lights flickering in the distance. He would think about the faces on the plane, the attendant's hardened glare, the stranger's hesitant eyes, the captain's final verdict, and most of all, the look on his children's faces, fear turning into pride. That transformation was what stayed with him. He knew the world wouldn't change overnight. There would be more flights, more classrooms, more sidewalks, where prejudice would try to strip his children of their worth. He couldn't fight every battle for them, but he could give them something more powerful, the memory of one moment when hate tried to break them, and failed. One evening, the boy sat beside him at the window, toy airplane in his hand. "Daddy," he asked, "when I'm big like you, will I have to fight too?" The father placed his hand over his son's. "Yes, but maybe not the same fight. Maybe your fight will be easier because of what we did that night. Every time you stand up, you make the next fight smaller." His daughter curled into his other side, her sketchpad resting on her knees. She opened it to show him a drawing. 4 figures holding hands inside a plane, their shadows stretching tall, reaching beyond the cabin walls. "This is us," she whispered. He smiled, his throat tight, unable to speak. For a moment, he just held them, the weight of their small bodies grounding him. Later that night, as the children slept, he turned to his wife. "Do you think it mattered?" he asked quietly. She touched his cheek, her voice steady. It mattered to them. That's enough. But deep down, he knew it was bigger than just their family. Because that night, in the aisle of a plane, strangers had found the courage to speak up. People who would have stayed silent had chosen truth instead. And the ripple of that choice had spread farther than any of them could see. In the end, the story wasn't about a father versus a flight attendant, or even about one family's suffering. It was about the power of refusing to shrink, about the lesson that dignity is not something granted, it is claimed. And so, as he kissed his children goodnight and turned off the lights, he carried one final truth with him. Hate had tried to humiliate them, but love had written the ending. And sometimes the loudest victories don't sound like applause. They sound like a child whispering, "You made me feel strong."